Hello and welcome to week 4 of rural health. So today we're going to be talking about the health needs of special populations. My name is Crnek-Georgeson and I'm one of the teaching fellows on this unit. So we'll go through some discussions, and I'm going to have a talk to you about the 3 special populations that we're going to focus on, but I'll also give you a broad overview of what the other populations are. I'll share my screen with you as we go along, and I'll give you some video links that you can have a look at either as you're watching the lecture, they're embedded in the lecture slides, or you can have a look at them afterwards. And then there are some things more towards the end of the lecture that we're going to be asking you guys to sort of think about and possibly post up onto your discussion. Okay, so let's have a look at the special needs of populations. So we've got populations such as Indigenous Australians, and so that we're looking at people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders. And then we've got, today we're focusing on people who are living in a rural area who are in the agricultural industry, so farmers, and their wives and families, and then also having a look at the townsfolk as well who support them. And then we're going to be having a look at refugees and the health concerns or issues around health access for people who are refugees. So let me share my screen with you and then we can have a look and we'll get started. So here we have health needs of special populations. So we've got included in our 3 focus groups today, we are, I would like you guys to also think about people or Australians from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are. We have Australian veterans, we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex Australians. We have refugees, farmers and older Australians living in rural and remote areas. So they are, if we look at special populations, they would be the key people that we would like you guys to be aware of. Today we're focusing on 3 of those, and as I said, we've got people working in agricultural industry, people who identify as refugees, and people from Aboriginal backgrounds. So let's break this down a little bit. My research is in rural Australia, looking at farmers predominantly and their families. So basically I've been having a look at the impact that retirement has on people who are living in rural or remote Australia, and thinking about the way that that affects people physically and psychologically relating to possible suicidal behaviours. So we have in rural Australia a very high rate of older males who have taken their lives by suicide. So that's double the national average. So roughly we have around 24 per 100,000 people who have taken their life, and usually their age is average around sort of between 18 and 25. And unfortunately our older Australian males, it's around about 40 per 100,000. And a large majority of those people are actually living in rural and remote Australia. We also have a very high suicide rate for our Aboriginal population, and that's unfortunately in a younger sort of teenage demographic as well, which is a very difficult statistic. But we'll talk a little bit more about Closing the Gap, the program that the Australian government is in the middle of implementing with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population in order to improve their health overall. Back to our farmers, we have obvious issues around geography when we're talking about people who live in rural and remote Australia. They live distances away possibly from each other, and then also from a local medical service, whether we have a community nurse or whether we have a GP. Some people, it may take them, you know, half an hour, 40 minutes to get into town, or even to see a specialist. It may be 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours drive one way. And then they have to think about who's going to look after my farm for the day. If we've got dry land farmers who have got produce or animals on their property, who's going to feed my animals? Who's going to make sure that they've got adequate water? What if one of them gets sick? I need somebody to look at my crops. What if there's a big storm coming? Like, there are so many things that people need to think about, not just, you know, or how far away is it? That's always a given when you live out in rural and remote Australia. But there is the other things that are compounding that. So we're hopefully all aware that we are still in the midst of one of the worst droughts that Australia has ever seen. Despite the rain that's been occurring in Sydney, the majority of those farmers have actually missed the ability to plant crops, which would have happened sort of February, March this year. They weren't able to even plant any crops because their ground was far too dry, and they missed that season, so they won't have any that'll sort of harvest in winter now. There are also a lot of the feedback that I'm getting from people out, particularly sort of down in the Murrumbidgee, sort of southwestern New South Wales area. They're saying that there's grass. They call it you know, the slang for this particular drought is called the green drought, because they are saying the grass is growing. But unfortunately, the quality of the grass is so poor because it hasn't seen enough nutrients going into the dirt because of the lack of rain. They're actually saying that the grass is just so poor that the animals aren't getting any nutrients out of it all, and farmers are still needing to give hard feed, which is very, very expensive. So there are a number of issues that are coming out around the drought, around climate change, that are on top of what's happening for a person. Say they may be experiencing pain down their right side, or blurred vision, or shortness of breath, or they have a poor knee that needs to be replaced, or even a child that has epilepsy and that needs to go and visit a neurologist on a regular basis. All of these things become compounded because of the distance. So it's very important for everybody to understand, when they're working with people from rural and remote areas, to think about what's happening for that person, but what's happening for their family member, what's happening or for their children or their spouse, their mother, depending on their age, or their grandmother, what's happening for the children in the schools, if they're able to get to a school, do they have kids in boarding school? I mean, there's just so many things to think about. We've got an issue around visiting doctors in towns. There are some towns that don't have a doctor. They're based in the town permanently. The doctor may visit perhaps once a month. And there's also, we'll talk about that a little bit more. I have a slide that sort of focuses on that as well, but we talk about the number of overseas doctors that there are who are working in rural and remote areas. Some of the other generic sort of health needs that we have for people are farming. The agricultural industry is a very difficult, hard, physically demanding job. It's also isolating. So we've got a picture here of a farmer, and most of the time these people are working on their own, and they purely by the nature of the industry are working on their own, or maybe with one other. Sometimes husbands and wives are working together, but if the financial situation of the farm doesn't allow for both the husband and wife to be on the property, then the wife is usually working off the farm, or the wife's working on the farm and the husband's working off the farm. It just depends. So they may well be by themselves. So that is in itself a difficult situation. So the other things that we have is, as I said, it is a psychologically demanding job. There's a lot of need to be self-reliant. There's a need for people to come up with a lot of solutions, like very quickly. If there's not enough feed for your animals, then where do you go? How do you source that, particularly in a drought? What do you do in relation to the need for, if your tractor breaks down, for example, and you need a spare part for that, or maybe Bob next door might be able to come over and help you fix the tractor because he might have some spare parts. So that in itself creates a sense of community and hopeful inclusion, which then would sort of decrease that level of social isolation, which we know social isolation actually contributes to psychological illness. So that in itself is not a good thing. And also being aware of what's going on with other people and being able to help other people is also of benefit as well. There's a point at the bottom of this slide that talks about the stoic nature of farmers. Stoic meaning, like, just not wanting to show the true feelings and always trying to be brave and present really well. Thinking about what's going on there, we wonder about who farmers are actually talking to. So we think about who they're talking to, why they're talking to particular people. So we know that farmers, from my research, that they're actually talking to other farmers, and they're also talking to vets, the people that come onto their property to help them with their animals. They also talk to people in town, and they also talk to vet nurses as well. So yeah, so we'll talk about the next slide being refugees. So I'll just stop sharing for a moment. Okay, so just in summary, when we're talking about our farmers, we need to think about the farmers and their husbands and wives, because there are women farmers obviously as well. We need to think about what's happening for them in relation to their health. So we've got sort of normal health deteriorations over the life course, but then you have children who have health issues, juvenile diabetes, epilepsy, children with learning disabilities, children with physical issues such as arthritis. So all of these sort of things that normally affect children in or living either in urban or rural Australia. And then it's compounded by the geography and the lack of distance, or the lack of ability to get to places, and the distance and the time that it actually takes to get to medical services, but also the number of people that are trying to access these services. So that in itself is quite large, and therefore would make waiting lists sort of blow out. So one example would be if a farmer wanted to visit a psychologist, if they decided that they were having sad thoughts, they were thinking about taking their own life, for example, or if they're in extreme pain and they weren't able to get to the doctor, then what do they do? Do they continue on with the pain? Usually they would wait till maybe there are 3 or 4 things wrong with them. So there's that, and then possibly by the time they get to see a specialist, either for their heart or their knee or any other type of surgery, then there may be a waiting list. There may be another 6 months before they actually get to see that person. So this is very important in order for you guys to actually to think about that. All right, so let's talk about what's happening for refugees. So the definition of a refugee, let's share my slide with you. And I've got a slide here that actually the definition is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. So there is a thing happening in Australian society that people are generally, they can be not very welcoming for people who are refugees. They don't understand that what's actually happened for that particular family, why they're they've moved to Australia. Quite often people think that they've just chosen to do it and then they can just go home when they want to. There is a lot of racism around this and other cultures. It's not just people who are refugees. And that stems from a lot of misunderstanding of where people are coming from, what their cultures are. And then I think it's also linked to the increase in terrorism. So that's made people nervous about people that they don't understand. So what's very important for you guys as students is to make sure that you have a very good attitude to refugees and also understand what it actually means to be a refugee, what is happening for the health of those people that have moved into whatever area it is that you're working in. And to be able to just learn as much as you possibly can about the different cultures or the religions and the family expectations and what's happening for that particular person and their family in relation to settling into the new area, whether they're they've been newly placed into an area, which is quite common for rural areas to have a lot of people. So we have Orange, Parks, these areas out sort of larger regional towns that have quite a high rate of people who have moved in there, have been placed in there by the services. So one thing we need to be very mindful of because of this particular group of people is their physical health and also any sort of psychological trauma that they have experienced because of where they've come from. They may have had to flee their country perhaps 5 years ago, and it's taken 5 years for that actual group or family the group of people to be located to where you're working. So it's important to try to talk in a very respectful manner about people who are able to think about asking them whether they're able to share their story, even if it's very briefly, because you don't want to trigger off anything. Making sure they're linked in with a migrant resource centre so that they can talk to somebody who knows their language, who knows their culture, and also for you to be able to understand what's going on for them as well. So finding out a base history of what's happening for them, what services they've been linked into, what they've experienced so far, what they need. So, and whether their children need to be in school, or if they're in school, if there are any problems with settling in there, all of those types of things. A very important part of working with refugees is understanding their level of health literacy. So health literacy itself being whether they have access to health information, whether they can read it, so if it's in their language or if it's been translated into their language, or is it just in English, what is their level of understanding when it comes to reading English? It may be great or it may not be, so but the important thing is to actually evaluate that. And then their understanding of health in general. So a number of people that I've worked with have not had any understanding of going to a hospital, getting free health treatment in an emergency, not understanding the system of Medicare itself and being able to go to a general practitioner about bulk bills. They have not had an understanding of a healthcare card, for example. So all of those things are important that's why it's good to link people in with migrant resource centres. And I'll talk a little bit more about a specific organisation that helps people as well. The other thing that you can see on the bottom of that slide there is not knowing if there's a doctor in the area, not knowing how to find a doctor, not trusting a doctor, or only perhaps wanting a female doctor. And as I said earlier, if you're living in a rural and remote area, then there are issues around that because maybe the doctor only comes once a month and it's a male, and then you don't want your female members of your family speaking to a male doctor. So it's about encouraging people to talk about that and then perhaps trying to see if they can be referred to a female doctor. There is an example here of STARTS. As I said, this is the service for the treatment and rehabilitation of torture and trauma survivors. So there's a video there that I would like you guys to watch This is a screenshot of their main website. Starts are an incredible organisation based in Sydney, and they have counselling for people. They have psychiatric assessment for people these are for refugees and newly arrived immigrants as well. So people who have got permanent residency or who are still travelling may not necessarily be here for a long period of time, but can certainly go there to get referral to other services that they can access. There's physiotherapy for people who are experiencing pain or any sort of physical sort of issue. Obviously, there's pain management, exercise groups, training, social groups. They have cooking classes. There are so many different things that I'll get you guys to watch the video on, and you will learn a lot about what these services can provide. There's a video here as well on the next slide that I would like you guys to watch that actually has 4 people's stories of people who have come to Australia as a refugee. They're people of all different ages. They come from different countries. And I think it's important for you guys to have a watch of that, just so that you get more of an understanding of what the journey is actually like for a person who has come here as a refugee. And then you can also educate by example, and your newfound knowledge, educate other people who may have a level of racism or a level of intolerance around people who have come to live in Australia. All right, so I just wanted to stop screen sharing for a moment, and then let's do a little bit of a summary. So ideally, when we look at, we're looking at people who are who have come to Australia as a refugee. They're experiencing quite a level of disconnect from their family members. If they've come out here just with the husband or the wife, with the children, they don't have their parents with them yet, possibly they don't have any siblings. They've lost that cultural connection, so it actually becomes a very strong focus for families to keep that cultural connection. And I often say to my students, if I was to be thrown out of my country or fled my own country and I had to go to another country, I would absolutely try to find other Australians who were eating similar food to what I eat, who were drinking cappuccinos, being able to talk about things that I love doing. So, going out for walks in the bush or cycling or skiing or all the things that I do as hobbies, but also as cultural things, like Easter's coming up and we talk about Christmas and the Melbourne Cup and all of these things that are sort of iconically Australian, not Easter or Christmas, but they're more Christian based, but barbecues and football and all of those types of things. So I would absolutely gravitate towards people that had a similar culture to me. And that's also a source of racism, where you find people say, oh, but they were all sort of living in the one area. I'd be like, well, that'd be me. I would be doing that. So that's what I think is important for us to try to imagine. Some of you may well have experienced this, or maybe refugees yourself, so you would know. I'm only sort of trying to imagine what it would be like, but your lived experience would absolutely be very valuable to your understanding of what's happening for people.